You are not the voice in your head. You are the one who hears it. Wu Hsin. Imagine waking up one day and looking into the mirror, only to realize that something is profoundly wrong. It's not a flaw in your appearance, but something more subtle, more intrinsic. You see the reflection of a person, but at the same time you feel like it's no longer you. As if at some point you've drifted away from your true essence, and what you see now is just an avatar, a representation. The mind, which you've always thought of as your ally, now seems to be your enemy. Who are you really? That body, that mind, the thoughts you have every day, who is behind them? What would you call you? Is your mind truly you? Or is it the other way around? Are your thoughts the ones possessing you? Now imagine for a moment that you could break free from these thoughts, from the endless concerns that fill your mind every second. Imagine a state of being where your mind no longer determines your identity, no longer being a slave to the beliefs, judgments, or expectations that shape your perception of yourself. What would be left of you? This is the paradox of our existence, the game of hide and seek between who we truly are and the figure the mind creates of us. For centuries, philosophy has challenged us to look beyond the reflection in the mirror, to question the very nature of identity. But what happens when you realize that your mind is not your true self, that you are something beyond it, something deeper and authentic, something that transcends the limiting patterns of thought? The big question then is, how can we free ourselves from something that for so long we believed to be essential to our existence? How can we escape the prison of the mind and discover our true essence? Before we proceed, take a moment. Breathe deeply and ask yourself, what if the key to my freedom is not a clearer thought, but the stillness beyond any thought? What if who I am lies beyond what I think I am? These questions are not merely philosophical, they are urgent, and they touch the root of our own perception of reality. A question that many avoid confronting, but once explored, can change everything. The mind, which we thought was our ally, might be the greatest obstacle to our freedom. So what does it really mean to be yourself? What happens when you shed this mental image? And most importantly, what do you find in the emptiness that remains when the mind is no longer driving your life? These are the questions that lead us to the next level of this conversation. But to answer them, we first need to understand the origin of this problem. Why do we believe so deeply that we are our mind? And what is behind this deeply rooted belief that shapes not only our individual lives, but also our relationships, our society, and even our spirituality? Now, let's dive deeper into this issue. When we look at the society we live in, one thing is clear. We've been taught, from the moment we began to think more rationally, that our identity is inextricably tied to our mind. Our mind has become the lens through which we see the world, and thus the way we see ourselves. But what happens when we challenge this idea? The belief that we are our mind is deeper than we think. It's the foundation of most psychological and philosophical systems, telling us that the mind is the key to understanding ourselves. Think positively. Control your thoughts. Transform your mindset. The advice pours in from every corner of society. Everything revolves around the power of the mind. But what if this is an illusion? Eastern philosophy, with its depths of wisdom, has shown us for millennia that the mind is not the center of our existence. Buddhism, for instance, teaches us that the mind is an illusion, a collection of processes in constant motion and flow. The mind we believe to be ours is nothing more than a collection of thoughts that arise, stay for a moment, and then dissipate. When the mind is seen in this way, it stops being a fundamental part of who we are and becomes something that simply occurs. Wu Hsin, in his writings, speaks about this phenomenon clearly and incisively. He tells us that you are not your mind. This statement, though simple, is one of the most powerful we can understand. But what lies behind this belief that we are our mind? To understand this, we must look at the profound psychological and philosophical foundations that have shaped this idea over time. Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychologist, wrote extensively on the concept of the self. He believed that the human mind was divided between the conscious and the unconscious. What we see as our identity, the thoughts, emotions, beliefs, is only part of a much larger picture. Most of who we are resides in the shadows of our psyche, in the collective unconscious, and in the projections we make onto the world. According to Jung, our identity is a mental construction that constantly tries to fit external and internal expectations, creating an illusion of who we truly are. To Jung, if one could see through this illusion of the mind, they would reach the self, a true essence that is pure and unchanging. Nietzsche, on the other hand, offers a fierce critique of these mental constructs. He argues that the mind, when trapped in rigid and dogmatic ideas, stifles human potential. For Nietzsche, the mind often prevents us from experiencing the freedom to be who we truly are, something beyond societal norms, family expectations, and imposed morality. Instead of seeking to understand the mind, he challenges us to transcend this understanding and free ourselves. He urges us to live beyond the constraints of thought and create our own meaning and values. Meanwhile, in the existential philosophy of Sartre, we find an interesting perspective. He argues that, contrary to what society and tradition teach us, we are not defined by what we have been or by what the mind tries to tell us we are. Instead, he proposes that we are defined by the choices we make in the present moment. The mind, then, is not the determinant of our essence, but a tool that can be used to act in the world, to create meaning, and to assert authenticity. Sartre takes us even deeper. The mind, far from being the starting point for our identity, is just a reflection of the decisions we make throughout life. Finally, Viktor Frankl, in his work on the meaning of life, offers another crucial step as he addresses the relationship between mind and spirit. Frankl teaches us that while the mind can be influenced by external forces, we are not chained to them. We can always find meaning, purpose, even in the midst of suffering and pain. The power of choice we have, according to Frankl, lies beyond the mind. He challenges the idea that our mind is all we are, proposing that our true freedom lies in our ability to choose how to respond to circumstances, regardless of the emotions and thoughts that arise. These thinkers not only help us understand the mind as a phenomenon, but also lead us to a deeper understanding of our true essence. The mind, though vital, is not all we are. It is a creation, a tool, but not the master. True freedom, as suggested by these great minds, is the freedom to look beyond the mind, to see what lies beyond it. But there's a much deeper question we need to explore. Why do we cling so tightly to our mind? The answer, perhaps, lies in the way society molds us from birth. Since childhood, we are taught to think, to categorize, to organize the world into mental boxes. We are told what's right and wrong, what we should want, and what we should avoid. In an increasingly fast-paced and unpredictable world, the mind seems to be the only thing we can control. But by doing so, are we not trapping ourselves in a limited and superficial version of who we are? The concept of identity is ultimately a social and cultural construct. The mind, with its thoughts, beliefs, and images, becomes our safest prison. But by understanding that this prison is not our true essence, we can begin to break free. The hidden problem lies in our identification with the mind, an identification that, in turn, shapes our perception of ourselves, others, and the world we live in. This process of identification is natural, but it is also one of the greatest obstacles to freedom. Now, before we move on to the invisible consequences of this mental cycle, it is essential to understand the true depth of the problem. This is not just an abstract philosophical issue. It is a matter of emotional and psychological survival. The mind, when misunderstood, can shape our entire experience of life, limiting us in ways we don't even realize. How can we then break free from this invisible chain? And more importantly, what happens when we finally manage to look beyond the mind and discover our true nature? These are the questions we'll need to answer as we explore the invisible consequences of our connection to the mind. The invisible consequences. Imagine living your entire life without realizing you're trapped, without even knowing that the prison you live in is built by your own mind. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? But this is exactly what happens to most of us. The mind, with its endless thoughts, limiting beliefs and self-judgments, becomes an invisible prison, shaping every aspect of our experience in ways we don't even question. These invisible consequences are everywhere. They are the backdrop of our daily actions, the relationships we cultivate, and the decisions we make. They reveal themselves in automatic choices, impulsive reactions, frustrations and fears that, no matter how much we try to rationalize, seem to govern us. The mind, with its incessant need to categorize and control, prevents us from experiencing life in its fullness. Like a radar that never turns off, it constantly filters reality through its distorted lenses. Lenses created by past experiences, entrenched beliefs, and often social expectations. Have you ever caught yourself, for example, creating a mental image about something or someone without truly knowing them? The automatic judgment, the constant comparison, the anxiety about the future, or the regret about the past. All of this is the manifestation of the invisible consequences of the mind. However, the most profound impact of these consequences is not just in what we perceive consciously. The scariest part is how these automatic patterns silently shape our decisions without us having full awareness of it. Think for a moment. How many times have you made decisions or reacted to situations in ways that, when you reflected afterward, you realized were more linked to fear, desire, or a belief that you didn't consciously choose? The mind makes us act in favor of an identity we've constructed, an identity that is not authentic, but merely a shadow of what society, education, or our past experiences have told us we should be. These automatic patterns are fed by a series of cognitive biases that distort our perception of reality. The confirmation bias, for example, makes us seek only information that reinforces what we already believe to be true. The availability bias makes us give more weight to experiences or information that are more readily accessible in our mind, regardless of their relevance or accuracy. These are just a few examples of how the mind, without any awareness on our part, silently governs the choices we make. We are not just living, we are being carried away by invisible currents of thought, belief, and emotional patterns. And then, what happens when this invisible prison becomes even stronger? When the mind becomes so dominant that we can no longer discern what is truly ours from what has been imposed on us. It's at this point that the social consequences start to emerge. The pressure to fit into patterns, to follow established rules, to be something you are not. This is a direct reflection of this identification with the mind. In a society that values performance, material success, and constant approval, it's easy to fall into the trap of the mind. All of your thoughts and actions become an incessant search for validation, to conform to external expectations, and this disconnects us even further from our true nature. But don't be mistaken. The greatest invisible consequence of identifying with the mind is not the fear of not being enough or the anguish of never achieving external approval. The greatest consequence is the disconnection from true freedom, a freedom that does not depend on control, worries, or expectations. True freedom is the ability to live without being enslaved by thoughts, without being defined by fear, pain, or anxiety. Yet this freedom is often unknown, hidden behind our own minds. We don't realize it, but all of our behaviors are conditioned by this invisible pattern of thinking. This prison the mind builds for us makes us feel like we have control over our life, when in reality, we are just being carried along by the flow of a river we don't even know where it leads. And the worst part, we often don't even know we're trapped in this cycle. Our fear of confronting our true nature keeps us stuck in this prison. At this point, the urgency of change becomes clear. If you never stop to question your mind, if you never realize that it is not your true essence, then you will remain trapped forever in a cycle of suffering and self-alienation. That's why reflection is so vital. That's why questioning the truths that the mind imposes on us is the key to liberation. The rebellion, how to break free. Now that we understand the invisible consequences of our identification with the mind, one urgent question arises. How do we break free from this mental prison? How can we liberate ourselves from something we've always believed to be an essential part of who we are? For many, the idea of questioning and abandoning the mental patterns we've built over our lives seems frightening, as if we're denying our very identity. Yet true revolution begins exactly at this point, when we choose not to be ruled by the mind anymore, but instead look at it from outside as a tool to be used, not a master to be followed. The first step in this rebellion is paradoxically an act of surrender. What the mind fears most is not action or control, but the acceptance of its own fragility. The mind is a reflection of our social, cultural, and psychological conditioning, but in its essence, it is not ours. It is like a wave that rises and falls in the ocean of consciousness. So, the first great shift in perspective we need is the acceptance that we are not our thoughts. This may sound simple, but it is profoundly subversive. This idea, which seems almost trivial, is the first step toward freedom. When you begin to realize that thoughts are not your essence, you break the invisible chain that makes them dominant. Carl Jung, once again, guides us in this process. For him, the first step toward individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, is recognizing the fragments of our psyche that have been hidden or denied by the mind. Only then can we integrate these parts and achieve a more complete and authentic understanding of who we are. We cannot free ourselves from the mind until we accept its presence without identifying with it. Once we accept that the mind is not who we are, the next step is to deconstruct the narratives it creates. Our mind loves to tell stories about who we are, about what we've been, about what we should be. But these stories are often limitations disguised as truths. They tell us that we're weak or strong, rich or poor, successful or failed. But what if these stories are nothing more than fictions created by the mind? And what if true freedom lies in abandoning these narratives and living from a place of pure experience without the filters of the mind? Buddhism, in particular, offers a fascinating view on this. It teaches us that true freedom does not come from resistance, but from acceptance. Accepting the constant flow of the mind without trying to control it or reject it is what allows us to transcend its hold. When we stop fighting what is happening in the mind, we begin to see that the mind, at its core, is just a transient phenomenon. Thoughts come and go, but our true nature, a pure and silent consciousness, remains unchanged. This is the point of rupture. However, this shift in perspective is not instant. It's a journey that requires discipline, patience, and above all, courage. It is not easy to break with the identity we've built over our lives. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of the concept of the Übermensch, someone who transcends the limitations of conventional humanity and creates their own meaning and values. For Nietzsche, the first step toward freedom was the destruction of old beliefs, those that limit us, so that something new and authentic can emerge. He challenges us to live beyond the bonds of traditional morality and to create a new way of being. But how can we live in accordance with this radical vision of freedom? One of the most powerful ways is by constantly questioning the authority of the mind. Every time a thought arises, whether it's fear, desire, or judgment, ask yourself, is this thought really mine, or is it a story the mind told me to keep me trapped? This simple questioning can be a powerful catalyst for change. Instead of following the dictates of the mind, you begin to create your own narrative, one that arises from your deeper consciousness, not from your conditioning. Furthermore, it is essential to cultivate the practice of meditation. Meditation teaches us to observe the mind without identifying with it. By sitting in silence, without trying to push thoughts away but simply observing them as they arise and fade, you begin to realize your true nature. The mind becomes a flow of transient energy, and you become the witness of it. In this space of witnessing, you find freedom. It is not a freedom that comes from avoiding or fighting thoughts, but a freedom that arises when you allow yourself to be the consciousness beyond them. People who have gone through deep transformational processes, like Viktor Frankl, show us how this freedom is possible even in the most difficult circumstances. Frankl, in his experience in the Nazi concentration camps, teaches us that, despite all the suffering, inner freedom cannot be taken from us. Even when thoughts of pain, suffering, and loss invade the mind, he shows us that true freedom lies in the choice of how to respond to those thoughts. Frankl found profound meaning in suffering by realizing that his mind could not define his life, but his consciousness could. The rebellion, then, is a shift in perspective. It is not a fight against the mind, but a transformation in the way we relate to it. By understanding that we are not our thoughts, we can begin to cultivate a new way of being in the world, a way that is freer, more authentic, and more connected to our true essence. Now, once we embark on this journey of liberation, the big question arises: what happens when we are finally free? What do we find when we manage to go beyond the mind and perceive our true nature? For that, we need to explore the final part of this journey, the ultimate truth that reveals the deepest and most transformative freedom of all. Let's continue and discover what awaits us. The most powerful realization. Now that you have ventured through this entire journey of exploration, acceptance, and rebellion against the mind, the time has come to face the final truth. What really happens when you break free from this identification with your thoughts? What do you find when finally you shed the layers of beliefs, judgments, and identifications that the mind has imposed on you? The answer is simpler than it seems, yet deeper than the mind could ever conceive. When you break free from the mind, you find the purest freedom, a freedom to simply be yourself, without masks, without the weight of imposed identity, without the burden of external or internal expectations. Instead of living according to a set of mental rules and patterns, you begin to live authentically, in harmony with your true essence. To understand this more clearly, imagine you've always lived in a dark house. The house represented your mind, with its limiting beliefs, conflicting emotions, and disturbing memories. You've lived there so long that you never noticed a door. This house, though uncomfortable, was your comfort zone. It was the place where you knew who you were, because your identity was entirely tied to it. Then one day, you notice a door that's always been there, but you never saw it. And when you open that door, a world of light and freedom opens before you. What you find beyond the door is not an identity shaped by thoughts, but a pure and untouched essence, something you could never have imagined while trapped inside the dark house. That door is the key to the final truth. It leads us to the realization that our true nature is not defined by the mind, but by something deeper, more primal, something that is beyond the limits of thought. When you break free from the mind, you access a state of being where the perception of separation between you and the world disappears. You cease to be a distant observer and become one with everything. You feel a deep connection with the universe, with other people, with every being, and with life itself. This state of freedom is not an escape from reality. On the contrary, it is a deeper encounter with it. When you break free from the mind, it does not mean you become a person who no longer thinks or feels emotions. It means that you are no longer enslaved by those thoughts and emotions. You begin to see the world clearly, without the filters that the mind imposes. You perceive things as they truly are, not as the mind interprets them. In other words, you achieve a form of direct perception, without the layers of constant analysis and automatic judgment. By breaking free from this identification, you begin to live a life of authenticity. You stop being the mental construction of who you think you should be, and start being who you truly are. True freedom is not the absence of challenges or difficulties, but the ability to experience life fully without those difficulties defining who you are. The spiritual master J. Krishnamurti said, "Freedom is the understanding that the mind is not you. And the mind cannot be free unless you understand its nature, its very construction. When you understand the nature of the mind and detach from it, you access an inner freedom that is unwavering, a freedom that does not depend on external circumstances." Now you may ask, but how can I reach this state of freedom? How can I truly transcend my mind? The answer lies in no longer seeking to control or overcome thoughts, but in simply observing their nature and allowing them to dissipate on their own. Instead of trying to change your thoughts or emotions, you observe them with a healthy distance, without identifying with them. Taoism, with its ancient wisdom, teaches us that true wisdom is not in acting against nature, but in aligning with it. When you align with your true nature, with your deepest essence, there is no inner conflict. You begin to flow with life rather than fight against it. People who have undergone deep transformations like Viktor Frankl show us how this freedom is possible even in the most difficult circumstances. Frankl, in his experience in the Nazi concentration camps, teaches us that despite all the suffering, inner freedom cannot be taken from us. Even when thoughts of pain, suffering, and loss invade the mind, he shows us that true freedom lies in the choice of how to respond to those thoughts. Frankl found profound meaning in suffering by realizing that his mind could not define his life, but his consciousness could. The final revelation is this: you are not your mind. You are not the thoughts that pass through your head, nor the emotions that come and go. You are the consciousness that observes all of it, the silent space between thoughts, the observer who is deeper than anything the mind can conceive. When you realize this, life becomes a free expression of who you truly are. And with this realization, everything becomes possible. This is the path to true fulfillment. And with this realization, everything becomes clear.